Welcome to our lecture on civil liberties. Today we're going to talk about why the Bill of Rights, why the framers chose to enshrine civil liberty protections actually in the Constitution. We will then use the First Amendment, the protection of free speech, as a case study to look at how your civil liberties are actually protected in practice. We will then finish up with a discussion on the challenge of hate speech, which demonstrates how difficult it is to draw a firm line between what should be protected civil liberties and what should not be. So, first off, what are civil liberties? Protection of basic freedoms that the government cannot violate without due process. So basically, actions that the government cannot stop you from performing unless it goes through the proper procedures. Due process basically means that the government must respect all legal rights that are owed to its citizens before it can violate their liberty. Remember, going back to our previous lecture on the powers of the state, the government has a monopoly on violence. In relation to any one individual citizen, the government is immensely more powerful. The framers of the Constitution recognized that this was really important and that the individual citizen therefore needed to be protected. Because inevitably, some individual will do something that someone in government is not happy with and would like to stop them doing that. And that person in power will always have more ability to restrict than that one citizen will have to resist. And again, because the framers had just emerged out of the colonial system under the British monarchy, they're very keen to ensure that citizens' rights were protected from abuses of power. These protections are generally centered around three key concepts: life, liberty, and property, and the protection of those. Framers thought it was very important that individual citizens be able to work, live, and own property where they wanted, be able to engage in free conversation and especially criticism of each other and especially of those in power. And in order to protect all those key freedoms, the framers physically wrote those down in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Now let's talk about why it was so important for them to actually write those freedoms down. So why the Bill of Rights? Many other countries have taken a different approach to protecting civil liberties. They may just be written into law, which is, remember, is different from actually putting them in the Constitution. Or the state may just make a series of promises that citizens have to trust will be kept. However, the framers took a much different approach. They wanted individual liberties in the Constitution itself. This goes back to the Anti-Federalist versus Federalist debate that we discussed a few weeks ago. Remember, the Anti-Federalists pushed really hard for the incorporation of a Bill of Rights because they argued that the federal government is too strong, and because it is so powerful, the federal government will inevitably restrict the liberties of its citizens at some point in time. Because those in power generally feel that they know best, somebody will come along who will feel that it's either in their own interest, in the country's interest, in the government's interest, to restrict the liberties of citizens. And so therefore we needed a strong check on the federal government, freedoms explicitly written in the Constitution. And going back to our discussion of the Constitution, remember, that's the rules of the game. Government has to abide by the rules set out in the Constitution. If it's not in the Constitution, then it's not a hard rule. And so the Anti-Federalists won this debate. They got the Bill of Rights incorporated in the Constitution. And very importantly, the Constitution is difficult to change. To amend the Constitution, you have to get 2/3 of Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate, to agree, which we know is very difficult. And then 2/3 of all state legislatures have to approve that amendment. So the Constitution is difficult to change by design because these are seen as core fundamental rules that we want the government to always have to follow. So let's think of what it might be like without a Bill of Rights. Essentially, we would rely on Congress to set out our liberties in law. This would still restrict the ability of the government to violate these core civil liberties. However, congressional law is much easier to change and modify than the Constitution. All you basically need is majorities, not 2/3. Majorities in both houses pass a change to those civil liberties and the president signs it, all of a sudden your rights have changed. So again, Anti-Federalists are suspicious of the power of the government. They didn't want to leave this up to lawmakers, And so they pushed for it to be actually incorporated into the Constitution, so that it's much more difficult to change. Still, even despite these liberties being written into the Constitution, there have still been times in U.S. history when most agree that the U.S. government overstepped these restrictions and seriously violated core civil liberties of its citizens. This video will describe the internment of Japanese Americans, so actually American citizens, at the beginning of World War II, right after Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Because these American citizens had Japanese ancestry, they were suspected of being possible spies and therefore were put in military camps with very little freedoms. So a very good example of what the government will do and even what citizens will come to accept in difficult times when they feel it is in the best interests of the country. Because there was not a lot of pushback from non-Japanese Americans against this massive internment. As we look back on this with the benefit of hindsight, this definitely looks like a significant violation of core civil liberties without due process. These American citizens were interned on a broad scale, entire families, without any real evidence being put forth to show that they were a real threat to national security.
My name is Yoji Matsushima. I was born in Portland, Oregon. I grew up in Old Town, or Nihonmachi, on 3rd and Davis Street. That was my home. My father was born in Okayama, Japan, 1899. And my mother was born in 1909. It was arranged marriage. My father and my uncle both got arrested on December the 11th. The money from the store was all confiscated. They couldn't touch the money. He ended up at Rocky View Jail for about 2 weeks. Then he was transferred to Missoula, Montana toward the end of December. That was taken in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and that picture showed the group from Portland. I believe there was about 78 that were in that picture. They were considered POWs, enemy aliens. We were separated for over 2 years, almost 2 years. My mother and dad, through the Red Cross, communicated, and they decided that they were going to repatriate to Japan during the war. I had a brother and a sister in Japan, and they wanted the family together, and they thought that it might be better if we were together.
So his story gives you an interesting example of how powerful the national government is, particularly in times of war, and how little an individual citizen can do on their own to protect themselves. A similar case actually made its way to the Supreme Court in 1944 by another Japanese American who was separated from his family. And the Supreme Court actually ruled that the U.S. government was justified in interning these citizens despite the lack of evidence because it was a time of war and therefore there was a risk of espionage and spying. I think it's questionable whether that would be the same outcome we would see today, particularly given the significant violations of privacy that the federal government has carried out in the name of national security following the September 11th attacks. But let's move on to a liberty that is very relevant today, freedom of speech, which is laid out in the First Amendment, which basically protects your right to worship how you please, say what you want, gather where you want, and provides these similar protections to the media. These are very basic protections. We might wonder why the government would want to violate these in the first place, but you don't have to look far to find other countries, other societies, and even times in U.S. history when The government has cracked down on certain religious minorities. Society itself has ostracized or even abused certain minorities based on their religious views. One core theme you see throughout the Constitution is focus on protecting minorities. The framers understood that under democracy, majority rules, and so therefore minorities can be abused, and so you have to put protections in there. You can also imagine the threat that those in government can feel when certain things are revealed about their past actions, criticism is leveled at them, massive protests to demonstrate how unhappy citizens are with the government, how threatening that can be, and how tempting it might be for those in power to use the power of the federal government to curb, restrict, or even end those kind of demonstrations. Elected officials know how powerful what the media says, how powerful visible demonstrations are, and how investigations can end political careers. These officials have to win democratic elections, and so they don't want the wrong narrative becoming too powerful. Most argue that this protection of free speech is the most important freedom because it holds the government accountable. Unless we know what our elected officials are up to, we can't make good decisions at the ballot box. And unless those officials know that they're being held accountable, it's likely that they'll try to get away with as much as they can. However, as a society, we all have different ideas as to what is free speech and what should be protected and what should not be allowed. There have been a number of interesting Supreme Court cases over the years that have generally defaulted to protecting free speech, except in certain cases. One question is whether those who are in prison still receive the same or similar civil liberty protections that those who are not in prison do, which is a good question because by definition a prisoner has had many of their liberties removed. And interestingly, in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that a Muslim prisoner in Arkansas had the religious right to grow a beard. At the time, prison restrictions banned the growing of facial hair. However, the Supreme Court ruled that it was his religious right to grow a beard, and that right could not be violated. The Supreme Court has also extended these protections to the type of religions that are practiced. Other prisons in the past have tried to restrict religions such as Satanism or white supremacy, religions that are seen by society as unacceptable, repulsive. However, the Supreme Court stepped in those cases and also said that the prison cannot restrict the prisoner's ability to practice the religion that they want. Going back to our discussion on minority rights, this is a good example of how the Constitution steps in to protect minorities, particularly those that are seen as negative by large parts of society, and how the First Amendment actually protects them and their choice of religion. Another interesting discussion that the Supreme Court has stepped into is what's called symbolic speech. So not necessarily verbal or written speech, but symbolic. A good example of this is burning the flag. Several states passed laws that banned and made it a crime to burn the American flag. However, the Supreme Court stepped in 1990 and ruled that these laws violated free speech protections. These citizens were expressing their frustration, disagreement, anger towards the federal government through the burning of the flag, and so therefore that is protected symbolic speech. So again, even though large parts of society may believe that this is inappropriate and should not be allowed, the Constitution steps in and protects these kind of actions. Let's move on to probably the most difficult aspect of free speech, hate speech. Hate speech is basically verbal attacks on a person or group based on their religion, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, or gender. So attacking and criticizing someone based on who they are. As a society, historically, some of the nastiest and repulsive narratives that have been spread generally fall into some form of hate speech. The racist, pro-segregation, white supremacist movements that we've seen throughout U.S. history are a good example. However, the Supreme Court has ruled that the government cannot punish or restrict such speech unless it is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action. So let's get into more detail on what that legal concept is, how it is applied. First off, this concept actually comes out of a Supreme Court case that examined the state of Ohio's attempts to stop Ku Klux Klan speeches in the 1960s, which were based in the KKK's white supremacist ideology, Ohio tried to pass a law to stop them. This went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually ruled that the KKK and their propaganda were protected in most cases under the freedom of speech. Because the statements held at that KKK rally did not express an immediate intent or immediate threat to anyone there at the rally, it was protected free speech. And how this has been interpreted over time is basically that advocating violence is protected. This is why neo-Nazis are still allowed to march, spread their propaganda, KKK still holds speeches, and the government generally cannot crack down on many of the horrible things you see and hear online because those forms of speech are advocating violence. They're not specific direct threats. Neo-Nazis can advocate, can say they support violence against Jews. White supremacists can say that they support violence against non-white Americans. And that is protected as long as they do not directly threat any one specific individual. Direct threats are not protected by freedom of speech. If the speech is seen as inciting violence, it is not protected. So if someone at that Klan rally, a speaker, had encouraged one of their members to go out and specifically target a certain individual, that speech would not be protected. But as long as the threats are general, not specific, generally it falls under the advocation of violence, and therefore it is protected free speech. However, this is what makes protecting hate speech so difficult, because it's easy to see how advocating violence can lead to real violence, real threats against individuals. But unless there is hard evidence of that, of specifically targeting specific individuals with threats, it's difficult for the government to crack down and restrict that because it still falls under the freedom of speech. Another question that often comes up is defamation, false statements of fact that harm another's reputation, that create reputational harm. These are also not protected, but again, you have to prove that the individual knew that these statements were false when they made them and that they have harmed another's reputation. And in all of these cases, generally the Supreme Court has defaulted to protecting free speech. Remember, the founders were always very suspicious of governmental power, and so Constitution #1 is designed to restrict abuse of power. And so the Supreme Court has generally interpreted that to mean if a decision is in doubt, default to restricting the federal government, not making it more powerful. Let's finish up this discussion with another Supreme Court case, Snyder versus Phelps. The Phelps family and the Westboro Baptist Church that they are associated with is pretty notorious for creating controversial signs, picketing funerals, even soldiers' funerals, very homophobic and controversial. However, many attempts to restrict their ability to engage in these kind of actions have been difficult because they claim free speech protections. I actually have a personal connection. I grew up in Topeka, Kansas, where the Westboro Baptist Church started. And so I used to see them and their signs most days just driving around town. We always wondered, why does the government allow them to do this? Why does nobody stop them? So watch this short introduction to the case, and I want you to think through the Supreme Court likely ruled on this case, and is that a proper application of the First Amendment?
Religion and free speech, and the explosive intersection of the two. The Westboro Baptist Church is known for picketing the funerals of U.S. soldiers and Marines in protest over what the church sees as the ills of American society, gays in particular. Today, their free speech case ended up before the Supreme Court, but we wanted to know more about who they are and what they believe. To get answers, my co-anchor Terry Moran boarded the Westboro van for our series, Faith Matters.
They're shocking.
God showed his wrath to thee.
They're cruel and outrageous, and for most Americans, simply beyond the pale.
Thank God for dead soldiers.
But should they be against the law? What the members of the tiny Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka, Kansas do at the funerals of fallen soldiers and Marines seems to have violated an almost universal sense of basic human decency. And they know it, and they're proud of it.
Well, you seem to have crossed a line for just about everyone.
You know what? How good that is for you to say that?
That's good.
Yes, because this nation has crossed every line of God's standards.
For 5 years now, the few dozen zealots who belong to the Westboro Baptist Church, most of them are from one family, the Phelps clan, have been spewing a grim and dark message. A message they argue that it's their First Amendment right to spread. And today they brought that message and that argument to the Supreme Court.
When you have a public funeral and you broadcast to the nation that that dead soldier is a hero and that God is blessing America, we will be there and tell you God is cursing America.
That's Margie Phelps, whose father Fred founded the Westboro Church. She's their lead attorney, and that's one side of her. Yet this is her yesterday. Yes, that's her wearing the American flag around her waist.
Did you ever hear that old saying about the lawyer who represents herself as a fool for a client?
Sure, I've heard that, and if I wasn't professional and if I didn't understand proper decorum, I've been representing this church for 20 years, and I've been picketing for 20 years, and I win them all.
For the past 4 days, church members and their kids have been making their way to Washington for their big day in court, traveling from Topeka along I-70.
All of these flags are going to have to go home into the laundry. Yikers.
Every couple of hours, they stop and picket or protest somewhere. Out come the hateful signs, up starts the hateful singing. This little church, as they like to call themselves, always attracts a loud crowd on the other side.
So this question of whether the Phelps family in the Westboro Baptist Church should be allowed to continue their hate speech against soldiers, their families, the gay community, and many more, found its way to the Supreme Court in 2011 when the family of deceased Marine Lance Corporal Matthew Snyder filed a lawsuit against the Westboro Baptist Church after they picketed at his funeral. And the big question that faced the Supreme Court justices was, does the First Amendment protect protesters at a funeral from liability for intentionally inflicting emotional distress on the family of the deceased? I'd like for you to think, based on what we've discussed so far, those previous cases that we've discussed, how do you think the Supreme Court ruled and what was their reasoning? Perhaps unsurprisingly, based on all of those previous cases I put forth, the Supreme Court ruled that yes, in an 8-1 decision, the First Amendment even protects those who stage a protest at the funeral of a military service member from liability. Despite nearly all of society agreeing that what the Westboro Baptist Church does, unacceptable and inappropriate, the Supreme Court still ruled that it was protected speech. 8 justices agreed. 1 filed the only dissent, Justice Samuel Alito, who argued that our profound national commitment to free and open debate is not a license for the vicious verbal assault that occurred in this case. Basically getting at that slippery slope argument that we discussed prior. It's hard to draw a line between when hate speech is targeting a general group versus specifically targeting an individual. But it's also very interesting that there was such broad agreement across both conservative and more liberal justices in this case. Both sides agreed that this conduct was nasty, but again, they defaulted to restricting the ability of the government to infringe on civil liberties. That anti-federalist focus on protecting the individual, number one. In conclusion, the Bill of Rights restricts the government's ability to infringe on those specific freedoms. They were specifically put into the Constitution to make it difficult to change, provide more permanent protection to the individual citizen. The First Amendment protects free speech and hate speech unless it is perceived as inciting violence. Several of the examples that we went through demonstrated how protecting liberties, especially the First Amendment, can be quite messy in reality. On one side, there's the argument that we must protect the civil liberties of everyone, regardless of how despicable or hurtful we feel their speech is. It cannot be a gray line, because once you decide who should be protected and who should not, that judgment can change over time. And if you create that kind of flexibility, as new people come into power, that judgment could shift and suddenly different sections of society are being targeted. That's the line that the Supreme Court has generally taken. However, we should note that protecting this kind of hate speech does create a legitimizing, empowering narrative. We've seen this more recently with the rise in white supremacist movement. And so for those who are targeted, this idea that all speech should be protected likely does not make them feel safer. So, very deep debate that will continue well into the future. I hope you found this interesting. As always, feel free to message me with any questions.